You think you're somebody." The officer's voice cut through the heavy silence in the courtroom, laced with mockery and disgust. He stood over her, gripping a pair of clippers in his hand, his face twisted into a smirk of unrestrained arrogance. "You think you have power here?" He yanked her forward by her hair, forcing her to her knees as murmurs of unease rippled through the onlookers. No one dared to intervene. The woman, however, didn't flinch. She didn't plead. She didn't beg. She held her chin. Her expression is unreadable, her gaze locked onto his with a quiet defiance that only made his grip tighten. "You people," he spat, shaking his head as if the very sight of her disgusted him. "Always thinking you can walk in here acting like you run things, like you're equal. But let me remind you of something in my courtroom. I make the rules, and I say that criminals don't get to walk around with their heads held high with one flick of his wrist." The clippers buzzed to life. The sound was deafening, and the humiliation was unbearable. A collective gasp echoed through the room as the first locks of her thick, dark hair fell to the cold, unforgiving floor. "You should be thanking me," he chuckled, dragging the blades mercilessly over her scalp. "I'm doing you a favor now. The world will see you for who you really are." The courtroom was frozen in shock. Some turned away, unable to bear the cruelty of what they were witnessing. Others looked to one another in disbelief, their hands gripping the wooden benches. The horror on their faces plain, but no one moved, no one spoke, no one stopped him. The woman sat still, her head being stripped bare, her dignity laid bare for all to see. Yet her expression didn't waver. There were no tears, no cries, no desperate pleas for him to stop, just silence, an eerie, unsettling silence. And then when it was done, when the last strand of hair had been stolen from her, when the humiliation had been stamped onto her body like a mark of disgrace, the officer grabbed her chin, forcing her to look up at him. Now he muttered, voice. Lowe was almost satisfied now. "You look like what you really are, nobody." A single beat of silence, and then she smiled, not a smirk, not a forced, broken expression of someone trying to hide their pain. No, a real smile, a small, steady, knowing smile. It was the kind of smile that made something shift in the air, the kind of smile that for the first time that day made a flicker of unease pass over the officer's face. He expected rage. He expected brokenness. He expected her to be shattered, but she wasn't. She just smiled. And then, in a voice calm and measured, she spoke. "Are you finished?" The officer blinked. "What?" "I asked if you're finished," she repeated, tilting her head slightly, her voice unwavering. "Because if you are, I'd like to get back to my courtroom." A chilling stillness spread across the room. Confusion flickered across his face. His grip on her chin loosened slightly. "You're what?" Slowly, she rose to her feet, brushing off her clothing. The weight of his act of humiliation rolled off her like dust in the wind. She met his eyes. Her own gaze was sharp and unrelenting. "You heard me," she said, stepping past him. "You just assaulted the presiding judge of this court." The officer's face was drained of color. The gasps that followed weren't just from the audience. Even the guards near the exit stiffened. Someone in the back let out a whispered, "No way." The woman, now stripped of the hair that once framed her authority, but not of the power she carried, reached for the black robe draped over the judge's chair. With slow, deliberate movements, she pulled it over her shoulders, fastening it in place. As the weight of reality sank in for everyone in that room, the officer stumbled back a step. "That's not." This is his voice faltered. She turned to face him, her presence no longer just a silent force of defiance, but an unshakable wall of justice itself. "You wanted to show everyone that I was beneath you." Her voice rang through the silent room, steady and unwavering. "You wanted to humiliate me, strip me of my dignity, and show this courtroom that I am nothing." She took a slow step forward. "But tell me, officer, how does it feel now?" He couldn't answer. He couldn't speak, because now every eye in that room wasn't on her in shame. They were on him. His breath came out short and sharp. He turned to the crowd, to the security at the back, looking for someone to back him up, but no one did. The guards near the entrance stiffened the attorneys along the sides and exchanged glances. The jury foreman swallowed thickly. The court clerk, who had been quietly documenting the proceedings, slowly lifted his gaze from his papers, realization dawning in his eyes, and then the doors opened. A flood of figures in black uniforms stormed in, their faces unreadable, their movements swift and precise. The officer's breath hitched. He took another step back. Wait, Hold on a second, but it was too late. Handcuffs clicked. The once powerful officer, the man who had stood moments ago with arrogance dripping from his words, now stood frozen in place, his hands wrenched behind his back, and the last thing he saw before he was dragged out of the very courtroom he thought he controlled was her standing tall, standing unshaken, standing with the quiet, unmovable power that no blade, no act of cruelty, and no man could ever take away from her. What happened next shook the entire nation. What happened next made headlines. What happened next made history, because justice was about to be served, and for the man who thought he was above the law, it was going to be brutal. Before we dive into today's powerful story, we want to take a moment to say this plot twist stands. Against racism in all its forms, no one should ever be humiliated, mistreated, or judged based on the color of their skin. This story is not just about injustice. It's about strength, resilience, and the power of karma. To every Black viewer watching, you matter, your voice matters, and your story matters. This platform is here to bring light to truth, to stand for justice, and to remind the world that no act of hatred goes unpunished. Now sit back, get ready for a story full of twists and justice, and don't forget to subscribe to Plow of Twist for more gripping narratives like this. Let's begin. The heavy wooden doors of the courthouse creaked as they opened, revealing the grand yet imposing hall where justice was meant to be served. The air inside carried the scent of polished wood and freshly printed case files, a place where the rule of law dictated the lives of those who passed through its walls. It was here in this very room that Judge Eliza Carter had built her legacy, a legacy of fairness, dignity, and unshakable moral conviction. She was a woman who had climbed through the ranks of a system designed to push her down, and now, as the presiding judge of the New Orleans Superior Court, she was a symbol of everything they never wanted her to be: powerful, respected, and untouchable. Eliza had always known that the scales of justice didn't tip equally for everyone. She had seen it firsthand, growing up a young Black girl in a working-class family. Neighborhood watching her father, a public defender, fight for clients who never stood a chance against a system that was never meant for them. She remembered the long nights when he would come home exhausted, defeated, but never broken. He had taught her that the law was a weapon, but also a shield, and she had chosen to wield it, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced, mistreated, ignored. She had worked harder than anyone through law school, through the endless nights of studying, through the dismissive glances of her peers who didn't believe she belonged, but she had earned her place when she was appointed as a judge. There were those who whispered that she was a diversity hire, a political move to appease the growing call for representation. They didn't see the years of dedication, the sacrifices, the battles she had fought to prove that she was more than worthy, and so she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove but everything to uphold. The courtroom was her domain, a place where her word was final. She had sent criminals away, overturned wrongful convictions, and held even the most powerful figures accountable. She had faced resistance, of course, men who didn't like answering to a Black woman, officers who resented her rulings, and prosecutors who thought they could intimidate her, but she never backed down, not once, and she had no intention of starting now. Officer Samuel Kingston was the kind of man who thrived in an environment where fear ruled, a towering figure with a square jaw and cold, calculating eyes. He had spent the last 15 years believing. He had friends in high places. He knew how to bend the rules, and he knew that as long as he wore that badge, no one could touch him. But there was one person he hated more than anything: Judge Eliza Carter. She had embarrassed him more than once. She had thrown out cases where he had fabricated evidence. She had questioned his reports, called out his unconstitutional searches, and made it clear in front of everyone that she saw him for what he really was, and he hated her for it. Every time she overruled him, every time she put him in his place, he could feel his power slipping away. It wasn't just about the cases, it was about what she represented. A Black woman telling him what he could and couldn't do. The thought alone made his blood boil. He had watched her, day after day, standing behind that bench, delivering verdicts, like she had the right to decide who was right and who was wrong. He had wanted to break her to remind her who really held the power in that building, and today he had been given the perfect opportunity. Eliza had walked into that courtroom just like any other day. The case before her was routine, a hearing for a man accused of resisting a restraining order, a case that, unsurprisingly, had been brought forward by Officer Kingston himself. She had seen it all before, but today something was different. Today, Kingston's gaze lingered on her a little too long. His stance was a little too rigid. The moment she stepped inside, she could feel the weight of something wrong hanging in the air, and then before she could take her place on the bench, he stepped forward. "You," he said, his voice dripping with something she couldn't quite place. She frowned. "Excuse me, do you think you can walk in here like you own the place?" he said, his voice raising his eyes and narrowing. "Do you think you can just show up and act like you're above everyone else?" There was a shift in the room. People turned, murmured, and spread. Something was off. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, keeping her voice level. "Steady, Officer Kingston. If there's an issue, the issue," he cut in, stepping closer, "is that people like you don't get to make the rules. You don't get to walk around here pretending you're better than the rest of us." And then, before she could react, before she could understand, he grabbed her. Gasps erupted. Shock spread through the courtroom like wildfire. "Officer Kingston!" One of the attorneys shouted. "Let go of her!" Someone else called, but he didn't. Eliza's breath caught as he yanked her forward as his grip on her hair tightened. "You want to talk about power?" he sneered, pulling her head back just enough for her to feel the cold buzz of the clippers before she even saw them. The sound filled the courtroom, loud, unforgiving, and then the first strip of her hair was gone. There were screams and cries of outrage. Eliza felt every second of it, every cruel, humiliating motion, as her identity, her dignity, was stripped away in front of a room full of people too afraid to stop him. And all the while, he was laughing. "You should thank me," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "Now everyone can see what you really are." The final strands fell to the floor, silence heavy, suffocating, and then Eliza lifted her head. She looked at him right in the eyes, and she smiled a small, steady, dangerous smile. Because what Officer Kingston didn't know, what he couldn't even begin to imagine, was that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The weight of silence in the courtroom was unbearable. The air was thick with something unspoken, something dangerous, something that had taken root the moment Officer Brad Kingston had made his move. Eliza Carter stood there. Her head exposed, the remnants of her hair scattered on the cold floor. The echoes of the clippers still buzzing in the minds of everyone present. She didn't touch her scalp. She didn't move to cover herself. She simply stood tall, her eyes locked onto Kingston's. The tension between them electric, crackling like a storm about to break. The room had been filled with gasps, shock, and outrage, but no one had acted, not yet. The guards at the door had frozen, uncertain whether to intervene, the attorneys, the jury, the court clerks. They all looked at each other, searching for a sign for permission to react, and then in the midst of it all, Kingston stepped back, admiring his work like an artist, appraising a finished masterpiece. "There," he muttered, tossing the clippers onto the judge's bench. "That's better. Now you finally look like the criminal you've been protecting all this time." The words sliced through the stunned quiet, and for the first time, Eliza saw something shift in the crowd. Horror gave way to realization, and fear turned to fury. It wasn't just what he had done, it was who he had done it to. And the moment the weight of that reality settled onto the room, the foundation beneath Kingston's arrogance started to crack. "Officer Kingston!" A sharp voice cut through the tension. One of the senior attorneys, a middle-aged man in a gray suit, was already stepping forward, his face pale with disbelief. "You have completely lost your mind. Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Kingston turned to him with a smirk. "I did what should have been done a long time ago," he said, his voice laced with arrogance. "She's been running this place like it's her personal playground, letting criminals walk free, questioning me and my department at every turn. Well, not anymore. Today she learned her place." A murmur rippled through the room, a dangerous murmur, a murmur that didn't sound like support. Eliza still hadn't moved, still hadn't spoken. She was letting it sink in, letting them all witness him, letting him dig his own grave. The court clerk's hand trembled as he reached for his phone, and that was when Kingston's expression darkened. "Put that down," he ordered. Now the clerk didn't move fast enough. Kingston stormed over, grabbed the phone from his hands, and slammed it against the desk with a force that made everyone flinch. "No one calls anyone until I say so," he barked. That was his second mistake. The guards at the door, who had hesitated before, suddenly stood up straighter. Attorneys exchanged glances. An unspoken agreement forming the courtroom was not his to control. He had overstepped, and now the realization was dawning slowly and suffocating on his own face. Eliza finally exhaled slowly and measured and took a single step forward. The sound of her heels against the floor was deafening in the silence. "You're right about one thing," she said, voice calm and smooth, a razor. "Edge is hidden beneath silk today. Someone is learning their place." Kingston's jaw tensed. His bravado wavered for just a second. "You think this changes anything?" he snapped, trying to regain control. "No one's going to stand up for you. Not against me. You think those cops outside will come in here and arrest me? You think the system will protect you over me?" He let out a short, humorless laugh. "You're delusional." Eliza studied him for a long moment, and then she tilted her head ever so slightly. "Tell me, Officer Kingston," she said. Her voice was dangerously steady. "Do you know what happens when a police officer assaults a sitting judge in their own courtroom?" Kingston opened his mouth, but no words came out. "Do you know what happens when there are dozens of witnesses?" She continued, "When there are security cameras." She let her gaze sweep the room, watching as realization bloomed across the faces of those present. "When every single person here just became a part of something that will be discussed on every major news network in the country before the end of the day." His breathing hitched. "And do you know," she added, stepping even closer, now voice dropping into something almost intimate, almost merciless, "what happens when the judge you assaulted, who you tried to humiliate, has the power to make sure that justice is served?" Silence for the first time since this began. "Officer Samuel." Kingston looked unsure, but then just as quickly he doubled down. "You think this is over?" he spat. "Do you think the doors of the courtroom burst open?" Two uniformed officers strode inside, not Kingston's officers, not the ones under his command. These men moved with authority, eyes scanning the scene, reading it in an instant, and then as the room collectively held its breath, one of them turned to Eliza and gave her a single respectful nod. "Judge Carter," he said, voice crisp. "Are you all right?" Eliza smiled, not the soft smile she once wore, not the knowing one she had given Kingston earlier. This one was different. This one was sharp, unforgiving, and cold. "I am now," she said. She turned back to Kingston, her expression unreadable. "Officer." "Kingston," she said, her voice carrying through the room, echoing off the walls, settling deep into everyone's bones. "You are hereby under arrest." It was in that moment, that exact moment, that it all came crashing down for him. His bravado shattered his confidence and cracked his power. The thing he had wielded so recklessly, the thing he had assumed would protect him, was gone. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "No, you can't." But they could, and they did. The officers moved toward him, and for the first time in his career, Kingston took a step back. Wait. Just let me talk about this," he said, his voice frantic, his eyes darting around the room searching for someone to save him. But no one spoke, no one moved. The people who had once feared him now watched him. The handcuffs clicked into place. Eliza didn't look away, not as they dragged him forward, not as his breath came faster, not as his protest grew louder, not as reality sank in. Because this wasn't just about his arrest. This wasn't just about the consequences. This was about something much, much bigger, because Samuel Kingston thought he had control. He thought he had power. He thought he had broken her. But the real power, the kind that didn't come from a badge or a uniform or brute force, that power belonged to her, and he was just starting to realize how deep his mistake really went. He wasn't just losing his badge, he was about to lose everything. And the worst part, he hadn't even seen the worst of it yet. The cold metallic clink of the handcuffs snapping shut around Officer Samuel Kingston's wrist sent a ripple of finality through the air, a sound that carried more weight than any gavel, more force than any shouted order. His breath hitched, his chest rising and falling in uneven bursts, as his mind scrambled for a way out, for an escape that no longer existed. Every muscle in his body tensed, instinct screaming at him to resist, to fight, to claw his way back into control. But for the first time in his life, he had none. The badge pinned to his chest, the uniform he had worn like armor, the weight of authority that had always wrapped around him like an unshakable force field. None of it mattered now. The officers standing on either side of him were not his men, not the ones who answered to his voice, not the ones who would have once scrambled to protect him at any cost. He knew their uniforms, recognized their insignia, and internal affairs. The words alone made his throat constrict. He knew what that meant. He knew what came next. And yet his body still clung to the illusion of power and still acted on the belief that somehow he was above this. He swallowed hard, eyes darting around the courtroom, searching for a single familiar face. Ally was a single person who might step forward and stop this from spiraling further. But every gaze he met held the same look, detached recognition, some with quiet approval, others with subtle satisfaction, but none with the fear he had once commanded for so long. He had operated under the unshakable truth that no matter what he did, people would always be afraid of him. That was his currency. That was his shield. The moment fear disappeared, so did control. And right now, as his pulse pounded in his ears and the weight of the handcuffs pressed against his skin, he could feel it slipping. His voice came out lower now, smoother, desperate, in a way he tried to mask but couldn't quite contain. "You're making a mistake," he muttered, voice thick with something between defiance and pleading. He forced a short, sharp laugh, shaking his head, still trying to convince himself that this was temporary, that all of this could still be undone. "You think this is going to stick? You think I don't have people in my corner?" His jaw clenched. He was talking more to himself than anyone else now, trying to ground himself in a reality that no longer existed. But then one of the two officers, a tall black man with sharp, unyielding eyes, tightened his grip on Kingston's arm. "You had people," the officer corrected, voice level unreadable. "Not anymore." The words hit harder than he expected. There was no bravado behind them, no self-righteous anger, just a simple, quiet truth. And that truth settled deep into Kingston's chest, thick and suffocating. He opened his mouth ready to argue, ready to push back, ready to spit out a threat or a warning or something. But before he could, Eliza Carter stepped forward. She had not spoken this entire time. She hadn't needed to. She had simply watched a silent force standing in the eye of the storm, letting every piece of this moment unfold exactly as it should. She had not demanded vengeance, had not thrown accusations, had not shouted or raged or cursed. She had stood there waiting, and somehow that was worse than anything she could have said. Now, as she approached, her heels clicking against the floor with slow, deliberate precision, Kingston felt something foreign crawl beneath his skin. "Unease. You're scared," she said simply. His body stiffened, shoulders pulling back, his pride instinctively rearing its head even as his stomach twisted. "I'm not. You are," Eliza interrupted, tilting her head slightly, her voice calm and controlled. "You're scared because for the first time in your life, you don't know what happens next." Her words didn't come with malice. They didn't carry the sharp edge of revenge. No, they were worse. They were a factual, matter-of-fact statement from someone who knew. Kingston felt his pulse stutter, but his mouth still worked on autopilot, still clinging to whatever scraps of control he could find. "You think this changes anything?" he snapped, his voice forced into something steadier, something that sounded more like him. "You think these guys are your friends?" He gestured toward the IA officers with a subtle lift of his cuffed wrists. "Do you think they care about you? About justice? They just want a scalp, and once they're done with me, they'll move on to the next target. You think you're special?" His lips curled into something between a sneer and a smirk, though it was thinner now, less certain. "You're just a pawn for a long, suffocating moment." Eliza didn't speak. She just studied him, expression unreadable and unwavering. Then her lips parted, her voice dropping into something even quieter. "Tell me, Officer Kingston," she said slowly and deliberately, "do you know what happens when a police officer assaults a sitting judge in their own courtroom?" His breath stalled. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. "Do you know what happens when there are dozens of witnesses?" she continued. "When there are security cameras?" She let her gaze sweep the room, letting the weight of that reality sink in deeper. "When every single person here just became a part of something that will be discussed on every major news network in the country before the end of the day." His stomach dropped. "And do you know?" she said, voice almost gentle now, almost cruel in its certainty. "What happens when the judge you assaulted, whom you tried to humiliate, has the power to make sure that justice is served?" Silence was thick, overpowering. For the first time, Samuel Kingston felt small, and then finally, Eliza turned to the two officers to take him. Kingston lurched his body, reacting before his mind could process it. "Wait!" he snapped, his voice breaking slightly, his feet stumbling as they pulled him forward. "I have rights. I'm an officer of the law." Eliza met his eyes, unwavering. Not anymore. The moment those words left her lips, something inside of him fractured. His breath came in sharp, ragged bursts. No, 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 this couldn't be happening. The doors of the courtroom burst open. A wave of cold air hit him as he was dragged toward the hallway, and that was when he saw them. The reporters, the cameras, the officials, the other officers, and his department, the men he had called his brothers, stood still, watching, doing nothing. His heart slammed against his ribs as his head whipped between their faces, desperate, searching. Someone, anyone, was going to stop this, but they weren't moving. They weren't even trying. Panic set in. They were letting this happen. They were letting him fall. The doors to the police car slammed shut behind him, locking out the noise, the voices, the flashes of cameras. His breathing was erratic, rising and falling in frantic bursts. His mind was screaming, but no words came out. Then, in the distance, through the bulletproof glass of the patrol car, he saw her standing on the courthouse steps, watching. No words, no expression, just watching. And as the reality hit, as his body sagged against the cold seat, as the weight of his own downfall crushed him, he realized this wasn't just an arrest. This was the end. Eliza Carter had won, and he had lost everything. The police car rumbled forward, its tires gliding over the cracked asphalt. The rhythmic hum of the engine was the only sound filling the confined space. The world outside blurred past in streaks of neon lights and the dim glow of street lamps, but Samuel Kingston barely saw any of it. His breathing was uneven, his chest rising and falling in quick, shallow bursts. Every inhale was tainted with the weight of impending doom pressing against his rib cage like a vice. His hands, now bound behind his back, felt foreign, stripped of the power they once wielded so effortlessly. The cold steel of the handcuffs dug into his skin, biting with every slight movement, a stinging reminder that for the first time in his life, he was not the one in control. His mind raced, searching desperately for an out, for a crack in the armor of the situation that he could slip through. You people don't even know what you're doing. You're letting a courtroom full of scared, weak people decide how this plays out instead of backing your own. For a moment, there was no response. Then the man beside him, a tall, broad-shouldered the second, an officer with years of wear in his face, let out a quiet scoff. It wasn't a laugh. It was something colder, something more final. "You still don't get it," the officer muttered, shaking his head slightly. Kingston's spine stiffened. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" "It means," the officer said, voice even steady, unshakable. "You thought you were untouchable. You thought that badge meant power and not responsibility. And now that it's gone, you don't know who the hell you are." Kingston's nostrils flared as anger surged through him, his body instinctively tensing as if he could shake off the truth embedded in those words. But before he could fire back, the woman in the front seat spoke, her voice cutting through the charged air like a blade. "You spent years terrorizing people," she said, glancing back at him again, her eyes as hard as stone. "You left bruises. You left scars. You built a career on fear, and now..." She turned fully in her seat, the faintest trace of amusement curling at the edge of her lips. "You're just another man in cuffs." Kingston's jaw locked so tight he thought it might crack. "This won't hold," he hissed, shaking his head, the desperation creeping into his tone despite his best efforts to smother it. "I'll get out of this. You think I don't have people? You think I don't have lawyers? My record speaks for itself." The officer beside him let out another short, sharp laugh, but this time it was harsher. "Your record?" he echoed, tilting his head slightly. "You mean the one that's being combed through as we speak? The one full of complaints, buried investigations, and cases that never should have been dismissed?" He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping just enough to make Kingston's skin prickle. "You don't have a record, Kingston. You have a cover-up. And guess what?" he smirked. "The cover's gone." A cold wave of dread crashed over him, so sudden and overwhelming that it made his stomach churn. His breath came quicker now, his heart hammering against his ribs as the full weight of what was happening started to sink in. They weren't taking him to his department. They weren't taking him anywhere near a place where his people could help him. They were taking him to Central. Holding his pulse, his muscles locked. "Wait," he said, his voice dropping, trying to control it now to steer it. "Let's talk about this." Neither officer responded. "You're making a mistake." He pushed again, forcing authority back into his tone, but it felt hollow. "Now, you take me to Central. You're opening a door you can't close. You think I don't have enemies in there?" The IA officer beside him chuckled low and dark. "Oh, we know," he said simply. "That's why we're taking you there." Kingston's throat went dry. The car slowed, pulling into the heavily guarded facility. The towering concrete walls of Central Holding loomed over them like a prison, cold and unrelenting. And the moment the gates locked behind them, Kingston felt it in his bones. This wasn't just an arrest, this was a death sentence. The car came to a stop, and before he could react, the door was thrown open. The officer ordered Kingston not to move. His body refused to comply, every survival instinct screaming at him that the moment his feet touched the ground, everything was over. I said, "Get out." A rough hand gripped his arm, yanking him from the car, forcing him to face them. And that was when he saw it. The crowd, officers, inmates, and guards, all of them watching, waiting, some whispering, some grinning. And then his stomach dropped because standing just a few feet away, separated only by a set of reinforced bars, was a face he would never forget. Victor Lyle, a man he had beaten, was humiliated and left bleeding in a cell without medical care. 2 years ago, a man whose case he had laughed about over drinks, boasted about how some people never learn their place, and now Victor was the one smiling. Lyle leaned against the bars, arms crossed over his chest, his grin slow and deliberate, full of something dark, something simmering beneath the surface. "Well, well," he murmured, eyes gleaming. "Look what we have here." Kingston's breathing turned shallow, panic rising in his throat like bile. A deep chuckle sounded from another inmate. "Aren't you poetic?" He could feel every single eye on him, the weight of them pressing down, suffocating, unrelenting. And then, as the officers started walking him toward intake, Eliza Carter's voice echoed in his head. "You're scared." And for the first time in his life, Samuel Kingston finally understood what fear really felt like. The heavy steel doors of Central Holding slammed shut behind Samuel Kingston with a finality that sent a cold shudder through his spine. The sound reverberated through the concrete walls, sealing him inside a place where he had once held absolute power. But now, he was just another prisoner. The fluorescent lights buzzed above him, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the dull gray walls, the peeling paint, and the metal bars that separated the men who had lost their freedom from the world outside. He could feel their eyes on him, the weight of their stares pressing against his skin like knives. He had spent years walking through places like this with his chin. His voice was sharp, issuing commands that were obeyed without question. Now he stood, shackled, vulnerable, and exposed. He had been the predator for so long that he had never once considered what it would feel like to be the prey. A guard, an older man with deep lines in his face and an expression of disinterest, took his paperwork from the two officers and barely spared Kingston a glance before motioning toward the holding cells to get him processed. He muttered, already moving on to the next inmate. Kingston's feet refused to move for a second, as if his body was rejecting the reality that this was real, that this wasn't some bad dream he could wake up from. But the grip on his arm tightened, shoving him forward, and suddenly he was moving. One step, then another. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to fight, to resist. But what good would it do now? He passed by the rows of cells, and the murmur started to build. "Ain't this something, Kingston? No way. No fing way. That's the cop that busted up Jerome's ribs." "Yeah, and look at him now. Isn't he so tough, is he?" The low and amused voices filled the corridor like an incoming storm. Some were whispered, others loud, but all of them carried the same unmistakable undertone: payback. Kingston exhaled slowly, trying to ignore the way the air felt heavier in here, the way the walls felt like they were closing in. He turned only to find himself face to face with Victor. Lyle leaned against the opposite wall, arms crossed over his chest, a slow, lazy smirk curving his lips. "Well, well," he drawled, shaking his head. "I got to say, of all the things I expected to happen today, this wasn't one of them." Kingston tensed, but said nothing. He had been trained for situations like this to assess, to de-escalate, to control the environment. But how could he control anything when he was the one in chains? "You don't remember me, do you?" Lyle continued, pushing off the wall and taking a slow step. "Closer?" "Nah, of course you don't. I was just another black man to you. Just another problem that needed solving." His expression darkened, the amusement fading from his features. "You broke 3 of my ribs. Kingston left me in a cell for 4 days, without medical attention. I almost died." A part of Kingston wanted to argue, wanted to defend himself, to claim that whatever happened had been justified, that he had been doing his job, but the words stuck in his throat, rotting, before they could even form, because for the first time in his life, he had no badge to hide behind. Lyle's lips twitched upward again, but there was no humor in his eyes. "And now look at you. Isn't karma an asterisk? Goose gastrus G." Kingston swallowed hard, the sour taste of regret settling on his tongue. "You scared?" Lyle asked. After a moment, his voice almost gentle in its mockery. Kingston forced himself to lift his chin to meet his eyes. "No," he lied, he chuckled, a low, knowing sound. "Yeah," he said, "you are." The words sank into his bones, heavy and inescapable. The next few hours blurred together, a twisted haze of reality that Kingston could barely process. He was stripped of his uniform, his name reduced to a number, his identity rewritten in a system he had once controlled. The officers booking him barely looked at him, treating him with the same cold detachment he had once reserved for the men who passed through his precinct. The irony wasn't lost on him. Then came the phone call. When he picked up the receiver, his hands were shaking. He didn't even realize it until he heard the first ring. 1, 2, 3. Then a voice. "You have a call from an inmate at Central." Holding the automated system, it announced there was a pause, then a click, and finally Samuel. His stomach clenched. Eliza Carter. Her voice was smooth and calm, carrying none of the anger he had expected. If anything, she sounded bored. He gripped the receiver tighter. "You think this is funny?" He snapped, his voice hoarse. She sighed softly, like she was tired. "I think it's poetic." His skin burned with humiliation, his pride scraping against the reality of what had happened. "I'm getting out of here," he muttered, his voice uneven. "This won't stick, you know it won't." Silence, then a quiet chuckle. "You really don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice laced with something almost pitying. "There's no one coming for you, Samuel. No one's pulling strings. No one's making calls. The people you thought would protect you, they don't exist anymore. You burned every bridge you had." His throat tightened. "Tell me," she continued, her voice dropping lower, "what does it feel like to know that you built your whole world on power and fear, and now you have neither?" His fingers curled around the phone, knuckles white, his heart slamming against his ribs. "Don't worry," she murmured, her tone almost mockingly gentle. "Now you'll have plenty of time to think about it." And then before he could say another word, the line went dead. The receiver in his hands felt heavier than steel. The silence around him roared. For the first time in his life, he had no control over what happened next. The phone line went dead, but the echo of Eliza Carter's words lingered in Samuel Kingston's mind like a ghost. He couldn't shake his grip on the receiver. It tightened until his knuckles turned white, his jaw clenching so hard that his teeth ached. He didn't move. He couldn't. The cold reality of his situation was suffocating, wrapping around his throat like a noose. The power he had wielded so easily, the fear he had instilled in others, the control he had taken for granted was all gone, and Eliza had spoken the truth in the coldest, most merciless way possible. There was no one coming for him. No favors were being pulled, and no calls were being made on his behalf. The system he had trusted to protect, men like him had abandoned him the moment he became a liability. He had seen it happen to others officers who got too sloppy, who crossed the wrong line at the wrong time. He had watched them disappear, discarded like trash, their names scrubbed from reports, their careers reduced to cautionary tales whispered over drinks. And now, he was one of them. A guard's voice snapped him back to the present. "Let's go, Kingston. Processing's done." His legs felt heavier than they should have, his body reluctant to follow, but he forced himself to move. The guard led him down another corridor past rows of cells, the murmurs and whispers growing louder with each step. The inmates knew his reputation had preceded him. Every man in this place had a story about him. Some had been brutalized by his hands, others had watched it happen to someone else, and now he was one of them. He could feel their eyes crawling over him, drinking in the sight of his fall. "You aren't so big now, are you, Kingston?" Someone muttered from behind the bars. "Where's that tough guy act? Thought you were a badass." Another voice sneered. "Bet you aren't going to last a week in here." Laughter rippled through the air, low and dark. Kingston's stomach churned. his pulse hammering against his skin. He had always enjoyed this part when the roles had been reversed, watching the fear settle into a man's eyes, knowing that he was about to lose everything. He had walked men down these same halls, had ignored their pleas, had mocked their desperation, and now it was his turn. The guard stopped in front of a cell and gestured inside. "This is you." Kingston stepped in the door, clanking shut behind him with an unsettling finality. He exhaled through his nose, turning slowly to take in the space. Small, cramped, claustrophobic, the thin mattress on the cot, the rusted sink, the scratched-up walls covered in old etchings from the men who had been here before him, the awe of sweat of time of forgotten souls. He had put people in cages like this his whole career. Now he understood why they fought so hard to stay out. "You'll get your uniform in the morning," the guard said, sounding bored as if Kingston was just another case. "File it to him. Try not to get yourself killed before then." The word sent a fresh wave of unease crawling up his spine. He swallowed, but said nothing. The guard walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the low hum of the prison around him. Then a voice. "So this is real, huh?" Kingston turned sharply. Victor Lyle was leaning against the opposite wall of the cell, arms crossed, watching him with an expression that was somewhere between amusement and satisfaction. He hadn't spoken when Kingston had been first thrown in, hadn't rushed to taunt him like the others. He had simply watched. And now, as Kingston stood there, feeling the full weight of his situation, Lyle's lips twitched into a slow, knowing smirk. "Bet you never thought you'd end up here," he mused, shaking his head. "Not a guy like you, not an officer." Kingston's jaw tightened. "Don't start," he muttered. I chuckled. "Oh, I'm just making conversation," he said easily. "See, I've been thinking about this moment for a long time, but even in my wildest dreams, I didn't think it'd be this sweet." Kingston exhaled sharply through his nose, trying to shove down the frustration boiling inside him. "I don't need a lecture," he snapped. Lyle raised an eyebrow. "Oh, you don't?" He took a step closer, lowering his voice just enough to make King tense. "Do you remember what you did to me?" he asked, his tone almost conversational, but carrying a dangerous edge beneath it. "Or am I just another name you tossed in a file and forgot?" Kingston didn't answer. Lyle scoffed. "That's what I thought." The silence between them stretched heavy and unforgiving. Kingston could feel Lyle's eyes on him, studying him like an animal that had been caged for the first time. He hated it. He hated the position he was in, the way he had been stripped of every ounce of power, forced to stand bare in front of the very people he had spent his life crushing. "You scared?" Lyle asked, echoing the question he had asked earlier. Kingston swallowed. "No," I smirked. "Liar." Kingston met his eyes, but whatever intimidation he had relied on in the past, it wasn't there anymore. I wasn't afraid of him, not anymore. Lyle took another step forward, closing the space between them. "You ever wonder what it's like?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more dangerous, being on the other side of that badge. "Having someone with power decide whether you get to breathe free air?" His smirk faded slightly, something colder settling into his expression. "You don't have to wonder anymore, do you?" Kingston felt something sour churn in his gut. He knew exactly what Lyle was saying. Lyle let out a breath, shaking his head. "See, the thing about men like you is you never think the rules apply to you. You walk through life, breaking people like it's a sport, because you think the system will always be there to back you up." But now he let out a small, humorless laugh. "You're in our world, and out here you don't have any badge to hide behind, no one to call for backup, and no protection." Kingston's breathing slowed, but his heart was pounding harder than ever. "You're just another prisoner now," El said simply, his voice carrying the weight of truth. The reality of those words settled into Kingston's bones, heavy and unrelenting. He had spent his life playing God, deciding fates with the flick of a pen, the slam of a gavel, the swing of a baton, but now he was nothing. No more protection, no more power, no more shield between himself and the world he had created. For the first time in his life, he had no control. And the worst part, this was just the beginning. The first night inside Central, holding stretched on, suffocating and unrelenting, pressing down on Samuel Kingston like an invisible weight that he couldn't shake. The cell was small, too small, its walls seeming to close, and the longer he sat in silence, the air was stale, thick with the smell of sweat, mildew, and the faint but unmistakable metallic tang of old blood he knew had been spilled in fights and beatings in the kind of slow, quiet violence that existed within these walls long before he ever set foot inside them. The mattress beneath him was stiff. He had spent years being the one who controlled conversations, who dictated how things unfolded, who decided who spoke and who stayed silent. But this wasn't his world anymore. This wasn't a precinct. Here his name held weight. This wasn't a courtroom where his testimony was enough to shape reality. This was their world, and he was on the wrong side of it. Lyle chuckled softly, shaking his head. "You don't have anything to say," he mused. "That's funny. You always had plenty to say before." Kingston exhaled through his nose, forcing his voice into something steady, something controlled. "What do you want me to say?" he muttered. Lyle's lips twitched in amusement. "I don't know," he said, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. "Maybe start with an apology." Kingston's jaw clenched, his pride revolted at the suggestion, at the idea of admitting anything but a darker part of him. The part that had been unraveling ever since those cuffs had clicked shut around his wrists, knew he owed more apologies than he could count, and yet the words refused to come. Lyle studied him, his expression unreadable for a long moment, before he let out a breath. "Nah," he muttered, shaking his head. "You aren't ready for that yet." Kingston lifted his gaze, something bitter curling in his chest. "And what, you think you're the one who gets to decide that?" Lyle smirked. It didn't fade, but his eyes sharpened. "You decided a lot of things for a lot of people, didn't you?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "You decided who got to walk free and who didn't, who got to go home and who got to rot in a place like this. Have you ever stopped to think about what it felt like to be the one sitting in that chair waiting to hear your fate from a man who didn't even see you as a person?" Kingston forced himself to hold his gaze, but something twisted deep in his stomach. "You think you're different," Lyle continued, voice softer now, almost conversational. "You think you're special, that you don't deserve this?" Kingston inhaled sharply, exhaling through gritted teeth. "I never said that." Lyle nodded slowly. "But you think it was silence that stretched between them, heavy and suffocating." Somewhere down the hall, a metal door slammed, a voice cursed, and another laughed, dark and mean. Kingston didn't turn his head or acknowledge the sounds, but the tension in his muscles remained coiled, ready. Lyle, on the other hand, remained relaxed and unaffected, like he had already adapted, like he belonged here, and maybe that was the biggest difference between them. Lyle had spent his life knowing that the world wouldn't protect him. He had been born into this fight. Kingston, on the other hand, had spent his life believing he was untouchable, and now he was learning the truth the hard way. "You look tired," Bell remarked after a while, leaning back against the wall. "Aren't you used to that, huh? Not knowing what's coming next, not being able to call the shots?" Kingston exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "What do you want from me?" he muttered. Lyle shrugged. "Nothing," he said, "simply isn't about what I want. It's about what you got left." Kingston frowned. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Lyle tilted his head slightly. "It means you spent your whole life thinking power made you safe. But now you don't have power, so what do you have left?" The question landed heavier than Kingston wanted to admit. He had built his whole existence on authority, on control, on the ability to bend situations to his will. But now he had nothing, no badge, no allies, no protection. The people he had once relied on had turned their backs. The system he had once trusted had chewed him up and spit him out. So what did he have left for the first time since stepping into this place, since being dragged through those doors, since the realization of what was happening had settled into his bones? He didn't have an answer. Lyle seemed to see it in his face, in the flicker of something raw and unspoken beneath his expression. He didn't press. He didn't push further. He just nodded as if confirming something he had already known. "Get some sleep, Kingston," he muttered, his voice quieter now, less taunting, more final. "You're going to need it." And with that, he turned, settling back onto the lower bunk, his body shifting easily into rest. Kingston, however, remained where he was, eyes open, mind racing, heart pounding, because for the first time in his life, he didn't know what came next. The days blurred together inside Central, holding, stretching endlessly, suffocating in their monotony. It became clear he had been abandoned. He spent the first few weeks in survival mode. Torres had been one of Kingston's cases, a man he had arrested years ago whose bruises had barely faded by the time he was processed. "Do you remember me?" Torres asked, his voice low, dangerous. Kingston didn't answer. Torres took another step closer, his grin widening. "I remember you beat the hell out of me when I was already cuffed. You laughed when I begged you to stop. Isn't it so funny now?" The other inmates closed in, the tension thick, the air crackling with inevitability. Kingston braced himself, knowing there was no escape this time. And then L stepped in. "Not today," he muttered, his voice carrying through the group like a warning. Torres frowned, glancing at Lyle. "What the hell are you talking about, Lyle? This man deserves every beating coming to him." Lyle didn't flinch. "Yeah, maybe he does, but you handle it now. You'll be the one rotting in solitary while he still breathes air. Let it play out. His karma is already working. Ain't got to force it." There was a long pause, the tension electric, and then after a beat, Torres clicked his tongue, rolling his shoulders back. "Guess you got lucky," he muttered, stepping away. The group dispersed, but the message was clear. His time was coming. Kingston exhaled slowly, his hands still curled into fists, his pulse still racing. He turned to Lyle, confusion flickering behind his guarded expression. "Why?" Kingston asked, his voice raw, uncertain. Lyle tilted his head slightly. "You're not worth dying over," he said simply. Kingston swallowed hard, something heavy settling in his chest. He didn't thank Lyle. He didn't know how, but from that moment on, something shifted. He saw things differently, not just the prison, but himself. The weeks turned to months. He was no longer feared. He was no longer powerful. He was just a man stripped of everything, and in that emptiness, he was forced to see himself for the first time. The arrogance, the cruelty, the years of abuse, justified under the badge. He thought about every decision, every choice, and every name in a case file that was more than just ink on paper. He had ruined lives, and now he was living in the wreckage of his own making. Then one day he was called to the warden's office. He expected bad news, maybe another case, another charge, another reason to keep him locked away. But when he entered, Eliza Carter was waiting for him. She stood by the window, arms crossed, her presence just as commanding in plain clothes as it had been in the judge's robe. Kingston hesitated before sitting across from her, his shackled hands resting on his lap. She didn't speak at first, she just looked at him. Finally, she sighed. "You've been inside for almost a year." Kingston nodded. "Once you've had time to think," she continued, "time to understand what it feels like to be powerless." He clenched his jaw, but he didn't argue. She was right. She exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "The system isn't built for redemption," she said. "But people sometimes, they can change." Kingston swallowed. "Why are you here?" Eliza studied him for a moment before speaking. "Your sentence is being reduced. You'll be transferred to a rehabilitation program outside these walls. Community service reintegration education." Kingston frowned. Why did she lean forward slightly? "Because punishment only works if it leads to something better," she said. "Otherwise, it's just revenge." Her words hit differently. They weren't about mercy. They weren't about absolution. They were about accountability. "Don't mistake this for freedom," she warned. "You'll work harder than you ever have in your life. You'll be supervised, and you will earn the right to be part of society again." Kingston exhaled, his mind spinning. He had braced himself for a life sentence in these walls. He had accepted that fate. But this was something different. This was a choice a year ago he would have spat at the idea, would have fought it, rejected it, refused to change. But now, sitting across from Eliza, his body battered, his spirit humbled, he only had one thing left, a chance. He nodded slowly. "Okay." She held his gaze as if deciding whether she believed him. Then finally, she nodded back. A week later, Kingston walked out of Central Holding, stepping into the light of the outside world for the first time in months. He wasn't the same man who had walked in, and for the first time in his life, he didn't want to be. Some mistakes could never be undone. Some damage was irreversible, but change was still possible. And this time he chose it. Life has a way of balancing the scales, whether we expect it or not. Power can be taken in an instant, and when that happens, the only thing left is who we really are, Brattle.